And I'm going to extend really a very warm welcome to all to this evening's presentation. The Great Falls Petroglyphs and their meanings. Notice that I didn't attempt the Abenaki name for the Great Falls Petroglyphs, the Great Falls. I will try it, but every time I try to pronounce this, I get it wrong. Kchi Ponteku, the Great Falls Petroglyphs in search for their meanings. This is the third and final part of the history talks for 2022, sponsored by the Rockingham Historic Preservation Commission in partnership with the Rockingham Free Public Library. I'm John Letman, and I chair the Historic Preservation Commission. This evening, our speaker is archaeologist Michael Fuller, who will present a talk about the meanings of indigenous rock carvings created around the world, while referencing the petroglyphs at the Great Falls in present-day Bellows Falls, Kchi Ponteku. Our Dr. Fuller is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at St. Louis Community College in Missouri. He's participated in over 60 archaeological surveys and excavations in Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Oregon between 1970 and 2022 as an ongoing research project locating and documenting rock art sites in North America. He visited and documented the petroglyphs in Bellows Falls in 2014. The petroglyphs at the Great Falls were carved hundreds of years ago. We really don't know how many hundreds, but a long time ago, by indigenous Americans who invested significant effort. Why? The petroglyphs were surely known to the Abenaki community, who certainly would have seen meaning in them. Why? The petroglyphs were recut in the late 19th and early 20th century by Anglo-Americans, most of them associated with the Daughters of the American Revolution. Why? Modern citizens and anthropologists find the petroglyphs worthy of listing on the National Register of Historic Places, originally in 1990. Why? Dr. Fuller calls himself an elder in the tribe of Anglo-American anthropologists and folklorists, and he will speculate on his answers to these various why questions. A few housekeeping items to avoid background noise during Dr. Fuller's presentation. Please mute your microphone. At the end of the talk, we'll have time for questions, and we certainly look forward to a robust conversation. Be aware that this evening's presentation is being recorded and will be available through YouTube. I'd like to again acknowledge our partnership with the Rockingham Free Public Library and thank librarians Ann Dempsey and Sam Maskell for their ongoing help with the History Talks 2022 series, which has been quite a success. It's made possible in part through funding from the Vermont Division for Historic Historic Preservation and the National Park Service. That said, let's welcome Professor Michael Fuller.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. A Professor Emeritus means that right now I'm only grading 50 final examinations for students in world religions, where in a normal semester at St. Louis Community College, I would have been grading 300 final exams. So, boy, I feel like I'm getting off easy. I teach online classes, which has been great for students and great during the pandemic 2 years. I retired from full-time teaching 7 years ago and joined the ranks of professors who lecture at sea. And so I leave on Friday to join the Viking Orion And for the next month, I'll be going up and down the coast of Canada and Alaska, doing lectures, escorting people on tours to archaeological, historical sites, and various things like that. I work for the Viking Cruise Lines. I'm a resident historian. I want to acknowledge that I'm going to be describing an archaeological site in the spiritual homeland of the Luno Abenaki, and that we all owe a debt of gratitude to the Native Americans who carved the wondrous designs along the Connecticut River. I have to acknowledge that I married 40 years ago the most amazing colleague who has been with me and still is with me, giving lectures and doing field work. We were together in a cave site examining sunken canoes, dugout canoes in Southeast Missouri just a few days ago. I'm glad to acknowledge help from a colleague of mine, Peter Ferris, to thank the Kchi Ponteku Preservation Commission, to Walter Wallace, who invited me to do this presentation, and to the Rockingham Free Public Library. So meanings, some point in time, hundreds, thousands of years ago, one or more individuals had an inspiration, something they wanted to communicate. And so they created those petroglyphs. They may not have created them in a single day, not weeks, may have been months, and it may have been over a lifetime that an individual or individuals created them. And there was an initial inspiration. And within several generations, people may have forgotten the names of those people who made the petroglyphs, and they may have begun to assign new meanings to them that may have been different from what the original artist had been inspired by. When Euro-Americans saw those, they must have puzzled and wondered about them and thought about ways of explaining them. I have wondered if the fact that there are antlers or horns on some of them could have inspired the Puritans to worry about the devil, by the way. I come from Puritan stock, by the way, from the Mayflower, believe it or not. So I can channel a little bit of their thought pattern in looking at that and worrying about it. Angels and devils, wouldn't that have been interesting if the early settlers at Bellows Falls had thought about that rock art in that terms? But the 19th and 20th century, anthropologists and folklorists are always trying to reach back and imagine what had been the Native American answers to what the why of the petroglyphs. And I'll talk about some of those explanations coming up here in a second. I primarily work with North American rock art, but I have seen rock art all around the world, in Australia and Africa and Europe and Asia. And particularly in North America, we get three locations where rock art tends to have purposeful meanings. We get rock arts in caves and shelters, which oftentimes have connotations to underworld and spirits and origins of ancestors emerging from below the earth. We get rock art in water context, and we get rock art in hilltops and mountain types, where they're oftentimes associated with celestial and sky type things. So you might say, oh my gosh, this is sort of already getting dull, I better sign off. Don't sign off yet, because I have three new insights to share. Now, they are my old white anthropologist folklorist insights. They're not Abenaki insights. I've not been able to go back in a time machine and interview the original creators of the rock art, but I have had insights from looking at your rock art that I don't think maybe have been put in print, and they probably aren't right, but that's okay. They'll at least give you something to think about it and talk about. The first one of the insights I have is inspired by the result of writings by a man named John Tanner. And John Tanner, as a child, had been kidnapped by Ojibwa warriors who had fallen upon his family's isolated cabin and apparently murdered a couple of individuals, his parents, and taken him away as not a hostage, but as an individual who they either planned to kill or to sell. And when they got him up to their Ojibwa village, they mistreated him. And an older Ojibwa woman, according to Tanner, intervened and protected him. And whether she felt compassion for him or she just needed a kid to pull the weeds, she one way or another saved Tanner's life. And as he grew into manhood, Tanner was a strong enough fellow that he was able to fight his way in and earn respect. And he learned the Ojibwa language. He would marry an Ojibwa woman, and he would become cognizant of Ojibwa traditions. Now, Tanner, at one point, discovered by the European Americans who were trying to set up a trading post with the Ojibwa, realized he wasn't Ojibwa, he was a Euro-American, and he could still remember a little English. And so they said, you're the perfect guy to serve as a translator. Now, interestingly enough, a physician, a medical doctor from England, traveling up to the area of the Ojibwa trading post, stopped and began interviewing Tanner, and he took down copious notes. And from those notes, he went back and published a book about Tanner's experience. The book was published in England. Now, did he send any money back to John Tanner? I don't think so. Did the doctor who published the book become independently wealthy from publishing it? Well, probably not. There was a huge appetite in Europe and in America, by the way, for the stories of captives and what they had experienced and learned. Now, what's interesting was the medical doctor who was interviewing Tanner had Tanner sing for him various songs. And one of them was a song that was used before you went out and hunted beavers. And Tanner, as he would be singing the song, the doctor said, oh my gosh, this is hard for me to follow. Tanner said, let me draw you pictures. And so he would draw pictures that are literally, each picture is a sentence within this sacred song that is associated with hunting beavers. Now, look real hard. Do you see the pictographs at Kchi Ponteku? Well, right there in the center is that egg-shaped drawing with the two eyes in the mouth that was made by John Tanner and given to the doctor, who then took it back and published it. And in fact, the doctor was a pretty good folklorist. He was taking down the actual terms in Ojibwa that Tanner gave for each one of those symbols. And so each symbol was basically a mnemonic device for him to remember what was to be the sentence sung. And here was this earth spirit that is welcoming and saying to friends, you know, this is what you need to be doing to go and trap beavers. Now, it's a friendly Manitou, is what Tanner had told the doctor. A Manitou is a spirit being, and he is of the ground, that is of the earth, or maybe of the rock right there, that Tanner was talking about. He's not talking about your site. He's not talking about Kchi Ponteku. He's talking about a ritual and a belief system among the Ojibwa, but I'm just drawing your attention to the fact that the symbol is very similar to what your petroglyphs are there at Bellows Falls, which leads me to my first conclusion. You have friendly spirits, okay? They are friendly spirits who may have been associated with fish and collecting fish. They may have been associated with beavers, with some exploitation of the riverine environment resources. Do you know what I'm saying? And they are there just as they were in Tanner's drawing of what was supposed to be going on to be sung as a man went out for that process of, in his case, among the Ojibwa, of trapping beavers. Second new insight to share with you. Are you ready for this? All right. A guy named Henry Rouse Schoolcraft, and there may be people in the audience now spitting and pulling their hair, oh, not Schoolcraft, who is held in disrepute by one set of scholars because the way he ended up writing and in his later years dictating his final research was pretty odd. And he was suffering cerebral malfunctions, however you want to term that, that caused some of his writings to be just downright peculiar. But what's interesting was Schoolcraft was fascinated with petroglyphs and pictographs. And he actually had a drawing of the petroglyphs that are at Digton Rock in Massachusetts. And he showed these to an Ojibwa elder and said, can you read them? Can you interpret them? And the Ojibwa elder said, well, yeah, this is picture writing, and that there are two varieties of picture writing. I'm not going to try to pronounce the terms in Ojibwa. I'm not an expert in Algonquin languages. I actually am really more in Siouan languages, which was the native people up here in the Missouri area. But the elder who was advising Schoolcraft said there are symbols that are simple and understood by everybody, and then there are sacred symbols understood by only a few. And so Schoolcraft said, well, what are they? And the elder was very interesting. He said, check in 24 hours. I need to study this. I need to go over this. And this is actually what Schoolcraft had provided the elder. And 24 hours later, the elder, whose name was Little White Pine, came back and said, well, this petroglyph site is describing a battle that had occurred between two different nations, two different tribes. And you know, what's interesting was Schoolcraft published that. He did not go along with fringe theories of the time that were trying to make lost races and ancient civilizations and other stuff like that. He simply said that this is art that was interpretable as being scenes or the lead up to a conflict between two different tribal populations. Now, hang on. What's interesting is on Schoolcraft's drawing and on the old photographs, we got two parallels to what you have there at Kchi Ponteku, the Bellows Falls site, the Great Falls. Over there on the right-hand side, you can see a couple of your little oval faces with the two eyes and the mouths, right? And these are spirit beings that are in the process of speaking. Now, I know I told you they were friendly spirit beings there at Kchi Ponteku, Bellows Falls. You might say, well, if they are friendly spirits, why aren't they smiling? That's because they're speaking. Their mouths are open, like my mouth right now, right? You know, they're singing. They are welcoming. They are chanting, and so that's why these mouths are in that round form, and then their two eyes are clearly visible. But what I really like is the petroglyph design on the left side, which is larger and which has this triangular waisted type of body. And I, being an old folklorist anthropologist, would interpret the design below the chin. Whoa, sorry about that. Below the chin, I believe what we have is a decoration of a shirt or of a tunic, a vest, whatever you want to call the garment that's being worn, actually has a design on it. I can see a plunging Thunderbird. I can see a couple of other design elements that are on there, which may be the name of that person, or may be their clan identity, or their rank, or maybe a special song that's related to them. Now, at your site, at Kchi Ponteku, you have something. You have a whole series of these small oval faces with the two eyes and the open mouth. And then you've got one much larger one that was not recut, and it's still in its original condition. By the way, that's a 10-centimeter photographic scale that by great prayer to the sky god, I said, please let it not fall down. And I position it there. And many times I get ready to take the picture and it'd come falling down. I put it back up, fall down. And usually about after 10 minutes of that, the spirits let it stay up. And I got a picture. So that's why there it is with the scale on it. Now, I see a great parallel between that Digton Rock, Massachusetts larger figure and your larger figure also, particularly because I think there's a design element on your larger figure. And I got to tell you, as I was thinking about your presentation today, and I hope you don't hate it too much, I kept on thinking, what are those designs below that larger face? And the first thing that popped in my mind is elk teeth, that they are elk teeth sewn on a woman's garment. Now, if you are a great, powerful young man like John there, and you want to get married, what you have to do, John, is you have to start collecting elk teeth, because you're going to need to have your mom and sisters sew those elk teeth onto a garment a fine deerskin cape that you will go and present to your fiance. And when she puts it on, that is her way of saying, I'm willing to marry you. Now, John, if you make one of those and it's got 4 elk teeth on it, she's not going to put it on and marry you. You're going to need to have one with dozens of elk teeth. How many of these elk teeth? They are the 2 front teeth of an elk. So you start doing some math. How many elk teeth did that guy have to create that fine cloak for that woman? Well, here's what you do, John. You kill a bunch of elk, you get your brothers and your dad, and then you take horses and you trade to other men who hunt for you until you get 50 or 100 of those teeth that you then sew on, and it is worn by your bride. And as your wife, she will wear this all of her life to show, if you would, the bride price, the dowry, the amount of energy and effort you put in to win her affection and heart, right? And the fact that you're either really rich or a great hunter or a little bit of both, right? Now, this is close-ups of some of these elk teeth garments that are in a museum in all places in Branson, Missouri. Yeah, top of the rocks. This is a private museum owned by the guy who's the owner of Bass Pro Shops. Do you have one of those up in Vermont? Well, they're all over the United States, and the guy's a billionaire, and he has an amazing private museum. It's scary, but you know what? You can get really close and photograph stuff, right? Which you sometimes have a hard time doing in other places. Is this what is being shown on yours? Maybe. I actually ran a de-stretch computer program on, and it looks like maybe there are superimposed smaller faces on this tunic, cape, whatever, that's being worn by the larger figure. And so that's another possibility. Maybe they're not elk teeth. And you're going to say, John's like going, Michael, there are no elk in Vermont. Are there elk in Vermont, John? John, nod your head.
Well, there's an Elks Club in Bellows Falls, if that helps you.
You could kill a lot of members of the Elks Club, wouldn't you? The other possibility is it could be seashells or other kinds of materials that could be attached on there that would have significance. And I think it could be the face of either a leader within the community, it could be a female leader within the community, or these could be spirit beings that are being represented for us here also. Now, actually, let me go back. I got to tell you, even today, as I was rehearsing this, I came up with a third insight for your Bellows Falls. I didn't make a slide for it, but I was debating about whether or not to say anything about it, but looking at John, I'm going to have to. Now, John, at Bellows Fall, there are these oval faces with the 2 eyes and the open mouth that have these things coming up off them, right? And then there are oval faces with 2 eyes and a mouth, and they don't have any things coming off the top of them. Those are not feathers. Those are antlers that are being represented. And antlers get put on things to indicate masculinity, while the absence of antlers are femininity. So your happy faces, this is my old white folklorist interpretation. Your happy faces at Bellows Falls are a mixture of both male and female, of masculine and feminine. And they are there singing and happily welcoming. And you're like, the Abenaki are going, they're welcoming us. Yes, they are. And I don't know, maybe they're welcoming everybody. I felt they were welcoming me when I was there, back a couple of, years ago. I didn't find them at all threatening or hostile. I've actually been to some rock art sites that feel that way, by the way. But, they seem to be kind of joyful and playful and as Tanner would said, friendly. And so the ones with the lines coming up of them, those are not guys with feathers. I don't think so. Those are simply ways of saying those are masculine spirits, because like deer, they have antlers. Now, we get that here in Missouri. We'll get these paintings of snakes with big antlers coming off their heads. No, our snakes don't have antlers. It's a masculine snake. And then right next to it will be a snake without the antlers. That's its mate, okay? That's its feminine. We'll get river otters being shown with antlers on them and beavers being shown with antlers on them. No, 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 no. It's a way of saying male. Now, I know in our white culture, we draw penises on things, don't we? But they didn't want to do that. So they had a better solution. Like the deer, masculine has antlers, feminine does not. And so I think that's what you're looking at. That's my third. You can now sign off. That's all the news that there really is in this lecture. But I will talk about some other sites. There's a site that was published in 2006 along the Ohio River to the west of you, quite a ways, I know. And what's interesting was this site was discovered by a group of amateur archaeologists who were on a kind of a float trip. And I guess they pulled the John boat up to this rock in a river, and they discovered that there were petroglyphs all over it. And they did what professional archaeologists would prefer they had not done. They chalked them. Yeah, don't chalk petroglyphs. No, no, no. Don't put chemicals on pictographs. No, no, no. But these guys did. And then they took pictures of them. And, there are many pictures of birds and the square type things and a turtle, square type things. My interpretation of these are lodges, either celestial lodges or earth lodges or underworld lodges. They didn't always have a scale, so they put a toothbrush sometimes in their pictures, because like I said, they were on a float trip. What's interesting about this Ohio site was take a look at that. The same rock seems to have a variety of different designs. One of them appears to be a historic petroglyph. It looks like a flag on a flagpole and a cannon, and that this would indicate whoever carved that had seen a British, a French, an American fort, and this was pretty cool. And they were putting it on there for what reason, I don't know, but a reason that tells us what? That there are populations in North America that were making rock art in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. We have a few rock art sites in Missouri that clearly, because they show horses or because they have a painting of the Sacred Heart, clearly were being created during the time of initial contacts. And so that's an interesting little petroglyph site to think about. Oh, I'm a son of Missouri, 5th generation born, so I've got to tell you about several of my favorite waterside sites. I'm going to confine myself to rock art sites right on the edge of water, because your site's right on the edge of water, right? So the Bushburg Mismer site, 23 JE 367, 23 is Missouri, JE is Jefferson County, 367th site found. This is a low water site that appears only once a year when the Mississippi River is at very low stage. I don't know if you can see in my photograph, there's ice, and that's ice on the Mississippi River. And it's come down enough that this spiraling petroglyph is visible. Most of the year, this is under several feet of water. Today, there is not a whirlpool there, but there may have been a whirlpool at that location in prehistoric time. We think this petroglyph is about 1,000 years old. It's Mississippian. And when the river was down, the petroglyph was put there to acknowledge the spirit that would cause the whirlpool that would always be seen there at that eddy. The reason there is no whirlpool today is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been very busy pulling out all the snags and then dropping riprap. You see the riprap rock there along the edge of the site. And you have to wonder if they didn't cover up some things and destroy some things doing that. By the way, whirlpools are not always bad spirit beings. Sometimes they're just playful spirit beings. They're just a spirit being that letting you know they're there, okay? And some of these whirlpools, though, would have been quite treacherous if you were in a dugout canoe. And so acknowledging them, offering something to them can make things important. Oh, wait, going back to my good old friend, John Tanner. John Tanner had the name of a Ojibwa spirit, a Manitou, which he translated as great underworld wildcat that causes whirlpools in rivers, but is also the ruler of the seasons. Isn't that an interesting thought? who's responsible for the changing of seasons. We've had the change of season here in St. Louis. It's gone from spring to summer. It's really hot. It's miserable. And that Manitou, that spirit creature, has decided to what? Change the season, being one of the things that would be responsible for. Now, oh my gosh, I love this archaeological site, which is in Stoddard County, Missouri, along the Mississippi River. This site comes up out of the water only once every 10 years. And it's always in the most desperately miserable winter that the water will come low enough that you can get this amazing petroglyph. Isn't that? I just love that photograph. I wish I had taken it, but I didn't. One of my colleagues took it and he shared it with me. And it's as if the bird is flying up out of the water, right? And is it a goose? Is it a thunderbird? Is it an eagle? What's interesting, now this is my photograph. I actually got to the site one day when the water was quite down on it. And so there's this very clear bird form. There is a footprint. There is a meandering pattern that some have interpreted as the Mississippi River itself, and it's meandering across the landscape. And then there is a female petroglyph. Do you see that petroglyph on the right-hand side? It is the womb being shown. And to say that this place is a portal, just like a woman's vulva is a portal from which birth occurs, that this is a place, a portal from which something comes out. And so it's a neat archaeological site, much like yours, originally probably not visible all year round because the water levels and water flow. This one, only 2 or 3 times have I ever known the water of the Mississippi River to be so low. It has to be so low, barge traffic is stopped. And that's my beautiful wife, by the way, standing with me there, freezing on Christmas Day, when she asked me how far to this petroglyph site. And I lied to my bride. I said, it's only a 1/4 mile. Now, I had bad directions. It was 2 miles from where we parked until we found that site. And she was frozen solid. And she always reminds me about how I cannot gauge distance. Well, it's because the property owner who gave me directions didn't know distance either. But there we are. That's what husband and wife archaeologist teams look like after 40 years in freezing. Now, let me tell you about a site in Puerto Rico that's very similar to yours. I thought you might like watching the water flow. Can you hear the sound of it? You realize your site would have come with sound, right? Isn't that an interesting thought? Mate, when I was there in an extremely dry time, and so I didn't have the sound of water, but there would have almost always been the sound of water flowing past the site. This site in Puerto Rico, I had a chance to visit it very recently when I was escorting tour groups around the island of Puerto Rico for Viking Cruise Lines. And I took a day off because this site was a real Indiana Jones adventure to find. Highly isolated, extremely difficult, could have broken your neck trying to get to this thing. But you can see all these petroglyphs on this boulder with the water flowing around it. And what's interesting is you get spiraling petroglyphs, which are like that ones I just showed you here in Missouri, to represent the power and the swirl of the water and all those things going on. You get a cross with outlining around it. And then you get some of your eye-looking types of things. Now, those are almost more owl-looking faces. And what's really interesting is you get this amazing frog petroglyph called Atabrea. That's what the indigenous Indian term among the Tiano Indians was for a spirit being of fresh water. And she is a frog, and she makes this croaking sound. And this was considered the song of this divinity and a song of her sadness over a lost love. There's a huge tradition about all that. This petroglyph actually shows up on a whole bunch of clothing and backpack patches and other things. And most people in Puerto Rico, the tourists, don't know what it means. I think I know what it means. And when I talk to Tianos, they're like going, yeah, no, that's the sign of this goddess, this who takes the form of a frog. There's the eye kind of forms. And there's one kind of like yours. And in fact, the description in among the Taino Indians is they lived in that area of the Caribbean where there's not 4 seasons. You have 4 seasons in Vermont, don't you? We have 4 seasons in Missouri, but down there in the Caribbean, there are only 2 seasons, wet and dry. And the wet season is the season in which this female spirit being, she controls what's happening in the environment, and she brings the water, and she gives the blessing to the planting, and the women are making the hammocks and the pottery. And the dry season, well, the dry season, which they're still in down there in the Caribbean, that's the time in which men are busy, there are things happening, and that's a time controlled by divinities that are the bats and the Batman, if you would, in the representation of the cycle of seasons and what's happening. So talking about rock art around the world that has relevance to yours or similarities to yours, there's a site called Hart's Bay. That's my half-meter photographic scale there. And a site that was originally published in 1896 by a folklorist who had found this boulder, 2 boulders actually, and was bringing it to the attention of the world. Here I am at the site, taking a picture of my scale, perched up there. I've said a prayer to the spirit beings, please quit knocking it down so I can get a scale photograph. By the way, while I'm taking it, on the other side of the boulder, a hurricane was coming. And the person who had come down to the beach and shown me where to find this was screaming, "We have to get off the beach before the hurricane catches." And I'm like, going, absolutely, because I wanted to get off the beach and get back to my nice cruise ship. And because it was honking the horn, it wanted to get out of that area before that storm hit. And what's interesting is you get some of these eye forms showing up, and that's right on the water of the ocean in the Caribbean. Another site similar with water interpretations is a site called the Reef Bay site, which is actually in a national park on St. John Island of the U.S. Virgin Islands. And boy, this is a hard site to get to. I mean, there's a trail for it, but it's like a 5-mile hike. I about had a heart attack coming back out of this trail. It was tough, tough, tough. And the other Professor Fuller did not go with me on this one. She was way too smart. I love this site though, because you got the reflection of the petroglyph into the water. I don't think you had that at the site Kchi Ponteku, because I think the water is always moving, right? I think you had that reveal and conceal phenomenon less than this reflective phenomenon. But again, you get these interesting sort of eyes and face forms showing up in this Caribbean area rock art. It's not, by the way, oh my gosh, people say it's space aliens, isn't it? No, it's not space aliens. No, it's not world diffusion. Thor Heyerdahl used to see stuff like this and get terribly excited because he was convinced that people were on boats going around the world putting this stuff on rocks. If anything, it's a shared distance ancestry concept. I've oftentimes suggested the first people who came across from Asia into the New World following the game trails or paddling along the coastlines, they had ideas of showing this way of recording spirits and spirit beings and ancestors, and so they made those. My Osage friends say, no, we all came out of the sky. We didn't walk across any land bridge. Fair enough. And my Hopi friends say, no, we didn't walk across a land bridge. We emerged out of the Sipapu in the Grand Canyon. I agree. And maybe they all brought those same ideas, whether they emerged from underground or came out of the sky or wandered over following game animals. I think there's a shared distance and distant ancestry to understanding these things. Now, Walter had asked me if I couldn't show some really nice pictures of rock art around water in the Southwest. And I've done a lot of rock art sites in the Southwest, but it was my friend Peter Ferris who provided me with some really spectacular rock art sites that are down in Texas. And they are sites that are, again, in an alcove along a slow flowing water source that allows you to get the reflective images. And so these are never fully covered by flood water. and that reveal conceal does not occur, but they are always there being reflected into the water. And I'm thinking that bird thing, and I know it looks like a flying fish or something like that, that may have been the way in which the populations in that area of Texas, the Weishul and other tribes, were representing a spirit being that involved rain and clouds and birds, because you gotta pay some respect to those creatures, because if you don't have that rain, and you have the droughts, and you have the loss of life and the death of the fish and all these other things. And the figure there on the right hand side may be a spirit creature, a spirit being, or it may be a priest, a shaman, a medicine person who's in some way asking and offering and praying that the water always be there, as it's so essential. Now, I suggested that your site there at Kchi Ponteku, Bellows, Great Falls, that the horned and unhorned may represent gender. And many times it's been tragic that anthropologists want to think that all rock art's being made by guys. Now, I got to tell you, here in Missouri, a lot of our rock art shows people with bows and arrows in their hands, and many times either war shields or severed heads. And indeed, I think most of those are probably being representations of guys. And sometimes they put horns on them. Sometimes they actually painted, I'm going to say the P word, penises. And so I'm like, this is guy rock art. I'm going to tell you about one site that I know of. It's in my state, called the Big Manitou site in Boone County, Missouri, 23 BO 476, found over 100 years ago. And it's visible, it can be visited. The site's along a hiking trail called the Kchi Trail. And what's neat is I maintain that this is feminine based rock art, and it most likely had a feminine artist who created designs that reflect the issue of pregnancy. I don't know, maybe you'll disagree with me, but I think, 1, 2, and 3 are almost suggesting the changes of a woman's body, its topography, as a child becomes visible and then prepares to be born. And that figure number 4 might well represent a divinity, a spirit being who is there to what? To a midwifery, to see the success of the birth of child and children. This is right along the Missouri River. I mean, you can throw a rock and 50 feet away is the Missouri River. But what's fascinating is where this is painted is over the mouth of a very large cave with a spring issuing out of it. And the spring actually surges, okay, with the rainfall in seasons, high water, low water. And when it's low water, when it's not surging, there's a bat colony back in there that's making wonderfully spooky sounds. And do you understand how this might well be seen as a portal within the earth and a place of spirit beings that are related to what? Conception and to birth, and for which there's no hunting symbols, there's no antlered figures. There are these wonderful panels that I believe represent feminine issues. And I don't think, again, this is just my crazy old white anthropologist interpretation. I think your site had both male, female, and gendered representations to it. And it's not related to conception and birth, but it's related to, oh, lovely thought. Both men and women are at that site, and they are responsible for something, right? They are responsible for processing fish, or for making beaver skins, or in one way or another, there's both spirits and humans of both genders at the site. I know it, prove it or disprove it, just kind of how things are going on. Now, you have petroglyphs that have been highlighted with yellow paint. And I know this is distressing because well, here's an interesting thought. We have petroglyph sites in Missouri that in prehistoric time, the Native Americans highlighted them with red pigment, with hematite. that had been mixed in with probably bear grease and other things that they applied in. And yours may have had that also, but obviously anytime it went underwater, that would be washed off, that would be removed. In fact, if you ever have a chance to go with me on a Viking cruise ship to Norway and Sweden, I'll take you to rock art sites where today the modern Norwegian and Swedish communities paint in the petroglyphs with red pigment. And they don't make it the old style way. They go down and buy it at the hardware store and paint. They fill in, and the archaeologists are always going, "Oh, please don't do that." They go, "Hey, it's our rock art. Our ancestors made it. It's always been red. We keep it red, because if we don't, we lose faith with our heritage." Isn't that a cool thought? And what's the red stand for? It stands for life. It's the color of blood, but blood is also life, isn't it? You know, it's the color of the sun. And I know we say it's yellow, but it's kind of reddish today here in Missouri. And so, you know, you got highlighted petroglyphs. I'm so sorry that the water hasn't scoured them out. It was a misguided thing that was done by oftentimes amateur archaeologists in the 1930s and 40s and 50s in Missouri. And that is putting commercial paint and petroglyphs to bring them out so people can see them and not miss them when they go down. And in fact, you see that big yellow band, that's some kind of marine paint that they were slopping on there. We actually have that on a couple of archaeological sites in Missouri. And I've always wondered who did that. And the answer is some probably Indian Relic magazine suggested if you find Indian paintings, highlight them or make them so other people can refine them by slopping some paint like that up on there. And no professional archaeologist ever encouraged that, but it shows up in several places, and you know, it's a problem. What about recutting your petroglyphs? Another misguided effort, but with good intentions. I got to tell you, we have two state parks in Missouri that have rock art, and during the 1950s, park rangers got out with hammers and chisels and pounded away and recut the petroglyphs at Washington State Park. They didn't recut all of them, but they recut the 6 or 7 most impressive of them. And to my heart, it breaks my heart because it removes the chance of doing certain kinds of dating processes. We might be able to look at the amount of weathering inside that to determine how long it's been weathering, to estimate the age. Can't do that now, it's been recut. I will tell you, I'm friends with the park rangers as well as with the state park archaeologist. And he's like going, "Oh, that was a horrible decision. I didn't make it." The park rangers are going, "We wish we could have recut them again or recut more of them," because the public can't see the ones that haven't been recut. And in fact, I have been with other archaeologists staring at the unrecut panels at Washington State Park, and we have a hard time finding some of the petroglyphs unless the sun is just at the right angle and the right amount of rainfall and you hold your mouth right. Sometimes you can see them, sometimes you can't. So recutting, not done today, absolutely not, but it was a thing that was done. And the guy who recut the Washington State Park ones in the 1950s, he kind of just took it on himself and didn't ask permission, and caught probably heck for it later on. I know the tradition is that yours were recut by the Daughters of the American Revolution or the colonial dames, who were attempting to highlight something that they feared, I think, would disappear or could not be seen or appreciated. And that's why they did that. So, Kchi Ponteku, I have given you 3 sets of ideas from my old feeble brain, from having taught this stuff for 40 years and researched these sites. I was only at your site for a few minutes, My wife did not go down with me. She took pictures from the bridge while I scampered down. And you're all going to love the fact that I was taking those pictures with my phone, okay? And my wife had the Nikon camera, and she was taking pictures as I down on me using the telephoto lens on the Nikon. As oftentimes she was trying to document probably my death. But, I didn't die again. And I climbed back out, and we were on a camping trip, and we were loving the state of Vermont and, visiting various places. And the family sort of knows if I can get wind of a petroglyph or pictograph site, I'm always there to track them down and see what's going on. I have been talking now for a good 50 minutes, which is way too long. I apologize for that, and we'll stop and take some questions or comments or criticisms.
Thank you very much. Those who have questions can put them in the chat if they wish, can use the electronic raise your hand feature on the chat. And if it doesn't get too out of hand, can just speak up. And I'll try to okay. Curious to know who exactly did deepen the carvings. Was it the DAR, or are there local memories of that? Walter, you may, if you're on, you may be able to answer that more authoritatively than I can. I think the DAR was involved back in the early 20th century, at least in marking the, putting, either filling in the things with paint or putting markings over them. You may notice that there are yellow stripes above some of them.
I have only encountered oral tradition, oral history, stories passed on that it was indeed the DAR. Now I can say that, as I've understood the stories, is that they were carved in 1930, which is the same year that the Bellows Bridge is dedicated, and the DAR had a major they participated in a very major way with the dedication of the Bellows Bridge. Of course, the Bellows Bridge is right by the petroglyphs. So I've often wondered, and there are all kinds of pictures of the DAR members standing around the Bellows Bridge and with the dedication there. But then just over their shoulder, if you will, sits the petroglyph. So I've often wondered if there may have been something going on there where they thought that this might be an opportunity to bring them out so that they could be seen by people who are going to be using this new Bellows Bridge. It's just a theory, just something. But again, I've not seen anything in writing, at least, about the DAR. There may be, I just haven't gone through the newspapers, etc.
A couple of points on that. First of all, in the process of building the bridge and other construction that has occurred around the falls there, which is the narrowest point on the Connecticut River for a long stretch, a lot of rock was blasted or cut or whatever, and certainly there may be petroglyphs that were pretty thoroughly covered over by that. And I think that there may have been a sense as the bridge was being built that that those petroglyphs that were preserved, that were still visible, ought to be made so that they could be seen. A questioner asks, where is the site and can one visit it? Dr. Fuller talks about climbing down and getting close to them. Let me say, first of all, that the local authorities frown on that unless you have the kind of credentials that he has. Go to the Bellows Falls end of the bridge, which is now closed, and either take the little path or road that goes to the right along the riverbank southward from the Bellows Falls end of the bridge and look over the edge, or go a little bit up onto the bridge. The bridge is closed to both vehicular and pedestrian traffic at this point, but if you go up a little bit, you can look down and generally see them. I would suggest doing that fairly soon before foliage and vegetation get to be at their summer maximum. They're generally fairly easy to see. Look for the yellow markings on the rocks that show them. And someone has asked how many faces are there on the local rocks? There are a half dozen to a dozen or so visible faces, I think. There's an interesting contrast between what currently can be seen and what is seen in, say, early 19th century pictures of the petroglyphs. And here I will pass that over to Dr. Fuller, who might be able to give a more educated answer than I'm giving to that question.
I did not stop to count, and I could go back over my images and see. Question, are some of these not original, but from the 1930s? I think they all probably were all where there was something. I don't think they were adding probably extra faces. My feeling was you probably had about 2 dozen that were there. By the way, the question on the DAR, about the same time this is happening for you at Bellows Falls, we had the DAR, I think, around the country get sort of wound up to document American history and heritage. And the DAR here in Missouri was putting up granite monuments with plaques on them, marking Daniel Boone's trail going westward. And they put a monument up marking the Great Indian Mound in downtown St. Louis. And they put a monument marking the road, the old Spanish road leading south out of St. Louis down to New Orleans. And, you know, it's an interesting thought. They might have originally thought or planned to do a plaque on your bridge that would have discussed the petroglyphs. And why didn't they? Well, money is one possibility, right? You know, good intentions, but got to get the cash collected. The Vermont Highway Department might not have wanted a plaque installed on their bridge, right? Because of engineering reasons or whatever. Maybe there was something there, but had over time, many of the plaques put on the ones by DAR in Missouri, the bronze plaques have been pried off and taken to scrap metal dealers. And so the DAR went back and they recut what had been on the plaque into the rock, assuming that was not going to be so easily stolen by metal thieves. And so like the Great Mound in downtown St. Louis, the plaque had actually been stolen repeatedly. And so finally they just cut it into a big granite boulder and left it where the Great Mound once stood. And I got into a debate with a young historian who believed that the DAR was doing this to thumb their noses at the Native Americans. I really don't think so. I think they were trying to say that there had been a landscape of people. There had been people in this landscape at the time of the Euro-American arrival, and to celebrate the Euro-American foothold and start of settlements, but to also recognize the fact that you know, there was a large Indian town that had stood basically on the site where modern day St. Louis is. And so there might have been a plan to put a plaque. Isn't that an interesting thought? And I find the notes and minutes, but whether they were kept and whether it was actually voted on and whether those records are very difficult to track down. But it may have been that the DAR had planned, and that their hope was by putting that yellow marks and by highlighting them to keep engineers and other individuals from damaging or covering them. In fact, that's one of the reasons you want your site on the National Register, because if the federal government decided to fund a reservoir inundating the Connecticut River, has the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers thought about things like that all the time? This would be an issue that would have to be dealt with. It would have to be mitigated. And so the Corps of Engineers might have to think about how to build a cofferdam around it, or more likely how to remove it, how to bring it out and move it up, sort of like the Aswan Dam. They moved Abu Simbel out of the flood pool. When you put a site like this on National Register, it means that if you've got federal government funds and you're trying to do something, you're going to have to be mitigating it versus just ignoring it.
Good.
Don't relay that to the Corps of Engineers, please. Delete that part of the lecture. Okay.
Let me turn to a question from Annette Spalding, who says that the other similar sites that you've visited where there's water, where there are whirlpools and potholes and such represent, or such evidences, geologic evidences of rapidly moving water. That's something that we've heard a lot about in connection with the site at Bellows Falls, that this is a place where water moved rapidly. And of course, fish came up the river and so on. Is this something we see commonly in sites that you've been aware of?
Yeah, I think your site was one of these sites, like some of those sites I showed you on the Mississippi River, where either seasonally or even decades, there would be a reveal and conceal of this art. And that at the time that it would be revealed, might suddenly trigger celebrations, requirements of offerings, pilgrimage. There might have been Abenaki people from some distance coming, if this would be occurring only periodically, or if it's occurring regularly, then it is sort of, again, something that would be part of a calendar, much like that petroglyph panel I showed you in Puerto Rico, and with patterns of the time of heavy rain, the water gushing and rushing around. The day I was there taking those photographs, there was a person actually having a spiritual moment. I mean, there was a person who was part of the Tiano tradition, and he was collecting water. He was bottling water that he was going to be taking back. And I did not stop and bother him. And my wife's like going, "Oh, this is wonderful, Michael. The colonialist archaeologist is documenting the site while someone's having a spiritual moment." I'm like, "God, I'm going to get out of here really quick." So I was taking my pictures and ran. But he may have been collecting that water for healing. He may have been collecting that water for ritual purification. I teach world religion, so you kind of know this is a worldwide phenomenon. The idea that water used to wash the dead, used to wash the newborn child, used to wash the bad knees, right? Got bad knees. And as a way of trying to wash away the trouble and the harm that is in there. And so the interesting thought, maybe people would come when the petroglyphs were exposed and collect water in gourds, in skin containers that would have the fact that it was water from that place, and that place was a friendly place and a blessed place.
A somewhat related question is the spiral design, which you showed in a number of illustrations, and I think it is present I don't know whether you're going to have to correct me, whether it's present in any of the petroglyphs at Bellows Falls or not, but may have a representation of of a road or of a spiritual road. Is this something you've looked at? And you certainly showed it in a number of illustrations.
A colleague of mine at Harvard University, Marshak, who's written considerably about the rock art of Europe, believes that there's almost a universal meaning to spiraling, and that is it represents time going through cycles, but repeating, just opening up the spiral in greater cycles of season, cycles of life, cycles of rise and falls of nations and whatever. It represents the fact that things come back around, and that the water goes down, the water comes back up, and that the water is a force. And just like time, it's not linear. It's going through these cycles, sequencing. And your questioner is maybe aware that there are places in the world where people build labyrinths, and you walk the labyrinth to spiritually journey to a center point where you are finally centered, and you gain an insight from that process, and then retrace your way back out through the spiral or the labyrinth. And was there a spiral pattern at Kchi Ponteku, Bellows Great Falls? I would have assumed there might have been, but maybe not. I mean, that site in the Ohio Valley I showed you, it had one of those spirals to it. And indeed, the fact that there may have been petroglyphs lost during the construction of the bridge, there may be petroglyphs that were not recut, that are there also to represent that time sequence, and that have weathered beyond my recognition of them and others' recognitions. Some of you may have been out to Chaco Canyon, New Mexico. There's a very famous butte called Fajada Butte, and there is a spiraling petroglyph up there. I've been to that site with permission of National Park Service, and that was the famous place where during part of the year the sun would allow a sliver of light to pass between two boulders and illuminate you to the central or the edges of that spiral, indicating the solstices and the equinoxes. And I don't believe, some people have decided that anytime you find a spiral, it's functioning like Fajada Butte. And I think that I kind of believe, like Marshak, in this deep human psyche, all of us have a brain, and we have a way of making sense out of cycles of time and life, and of rivers rising and falling. That's maybe why these patterns show up. They also do look like whirlpools in an aggravated body of river water flowing, and those demand also an answer, don't they?
I suppose I should have turned first when the question came up about who did the recarving to Larry Clark, because Larry is always right out in front with a news item or something to show the answer to a question from a more recent Bellows Falls history. Larry, if you can at least summarize what you have in front of you about the recutting of the petroglyphs, that may at least partially answer the question we talked about a few moments ago.
Okay, actually I can be pretty definitive on it. The Bellows Falls Times, June 26, 1930. DAR discussed rubbish dumped on Indian heads. And again, the petroglyphs is a fairly new thing. I grew up hearing about the Indian carvings. At the annual meeting of William French chapter of the DAR, the placing of a marker at the site of the Tucker Toll Bridge was discussed. And of course, as a precursor to the Vilas Bridge that's there now. Owing for the uncertainty as to the life of the present structure, Action on the matter was deferred for the present. This bridge was the first to be built across the Connecticut River. And of course, we know it wasn't, it was at least the second one, but that's okay. The subject of the public dump at the toll bridge, which now covers the Indian Heads, was discussed. Recently, the chapter had the heads recut at quite some expense and effort. And then it goes on to Ethel Hill reported that the annual prize of $5 in gold, which was given to the high school pupil with the best marks in American history, and so forth. So it didn't say a whole lot about it, other than the fact that they defined that, yes, the DAR did it, and it was done just prior to June of 1930.
And big surprise, Ethel Hill had something to do with it.
Well, yes, and all good meaning things. And just as another note, I do have an original photograph that I found in an old photo album, which all the rest of the pictures are in the 1910 to 1920 range. And the picture does show the petroglyphs, and you can see that they are quite eroded at the time. Still visible, still in the same format as they are recut, but definitely a whole lot fainter, but no yellow paint. And I do have a question. Do we have access to the LiDAR survey that was done by the state of Vermont several years ago?
Walter?
I cannot say for certain, but I can, and I did notice that there were some questions posed about a project that has been funded by the National Park Service for the next 2 years. We have a project that will be revisiting the initial nomination to the National Register of Kchi Ponteku, the petroglyphs at the Great Falls. Sorry, my stuttering gets in the way. It is something that we know that the state did do some LiDARing of the some LiDAR scans of the petroglyphs, and I believe that we will be looking over those scans and having conversations with the state archaeologist as we move forward with the project. The project, by the way, was just recently funded. We put the proposal in. I must say that I met Dr. Michael Fuller. He very graciously allowed us to use some of the pictures that he took of the site from his 2014 visit that were then used as part of the proposal. So I would like to publicly acknowledge and thank Dr. Fuller for helping us portray and help convince the National Park Service that in fact these are really worthy of the kind of study that we're up and running with now. So we will be getting, I'm sure that we'll be getting the LiDAR studies, although I will defer to the two co-directors of the project, Rich Holshoe, who is the Historic Preservation Officer of the Elnu Abenaki community, and the co-director, he's co-director along with Gail Golek, an archaeologist who's done a lot of work in this area, in this region, and I'm sure that they will be pursuing some of that with the state archaeologist.
A question that someone has put on the thing, I think asks us to be a little more precise about the present status of the presence of the petroglyphs on the National Register. They are part of the Island National Register District. Is that is a correct statement, I believe. So
Yes.
they are on the National Register. However, the new project will provide more information and clarity about their significance. Am I stating that correctly, Walter?
Yes.
Okay.
The current status is that they are a contributing site to the National Register of Historic Places for the multi-use island, the Bellows Falls Island. It's one of many, many elements to the site, to the National Register site, along with industrial sites, industrial buildings, bridges, etc. It's almost as an afterthought. It's there and it's part of this larger whole, but it really doesn't put it into the human context that subsequent scholarship is already it suggests that these carvings are part of a much larger landscape that's of historic importance. That does not come out of the current National Register nomination, which was put together back in 1988, confirmed in 1990, and there's been a lot of scholarship done since then, and a lot of work that I think that will be forging forth with the project, so that we will be that's why we're revisiting petroglyphs as part of a larger landscape that is the Great Falls.
Just a little additional piece of confusion there. The petroglyphs that we generally look at are on the west bank of the Connecticut River, and therefore are in the state of Vermont. The bridge, the central channel of the river, and the east bank of the river are all in the state of New Hampshire. That doesn't preclude their being included in looking at all of this, but it just adds some jurisdictional confusion to the whole story. Let's see. Question that I think Annette may be able to answer. Who owns the Brattleboro site? And this is federally protected. Is it state protected? And do any of the Native American communities have any jurisdictional protection over it? Annette, do you know answers to that question?
Hi, can you hear me right now?
Yes, I hear well.
Okay, I was diving earlier, so don't mind the way I look. So I do not have the exact answer for that. It is on the West River. It's at the confluence of the West River and the Connecticut River. They're underwater. At one time, they were not underwater, of course. In 1907, when they built the dam in Vernon, the water level was only supposed to go up a few feet, but it went up many feet, about 8 feet, I think it was. And so that site was covered completely with water. And it used to be right at water level. So when I rediscovered that site, it was under 8 inches of sand, and it was what was called Indian rock. I don't know because it's unnaturally underwater. So I don't know if that land, I really don't have the answer to that. But I do have some information about the LIDAR. I did talk to Jess Robinson, the state archaeologist, in 2019. And it was right after, I'm just trying to find my notes here. Oh my gosh, how do I do this? Oh my gosh, please don't mind the way I look. I'm just like, I'm trying to find my notes. Here they are, right here. So I asked Jess Robinson about the LIDAR in May 8th, 2019. Brennan, who worked and said, "Hi, Annette, I am connecting you here with Brennan Gauthier, archaeologist at Vermont Trans, who was one of the sponsors of the LIDAR imagery in Bellows Falls. Brennan, she was interested in the products of that work, and if she could potentially have access to it, or if we were plan on making the data public in any way. Thanks to you both, Jess." And so he said to me, the scans are being processed this spring. So that was spring of 2020 by our survey section. But if she has access to rendering software, I can send her the raw scans. More than happy to help. So then after that, and I can't find my email, but there was actually a website you could go on and you can see the whole thing, which is so fascinating. And I'm so sorry I don't have the answer to the West River, but it was a very emotional, 30 years of looking for this off and on. And what was so weird was I actually found the single petroglyph, the single face petroglyph. And Ed Lennox, who just released his 10th book, and it's actually in there about this West River discovery. And it's so exciting because I never dreamed that I would ever find that. I never ever dreamed I would have found that single image first, and it looks just like the one in Bellows Falls. So that was my long answer, though. Sorry.
One additional comment and question from David Deacon, who comments that there were some other DAR monuments, for example, to John Williams up at near the intersection of the Williams River and the Connecticut River, to John Kilburn over in Walpole across the river, and also mentions under the heading of the story of flood control, a book entitled Flood Control Politics, the Connecticut River Valley Problem, 1927 to 1950, written by William Edward Leuchtenberg. And I'm going to put it up there so people can see it, sort of. I have not read that book from cover to cover, but it has a lot to say about how the Connecticut River was worked out, and that's a whole area of history that's worth our attention and interacts with some of these more ancient stories. Let's see. Question comes, are there accounts from original natives or successive generations relating to the portraits and petroglyphs? Dr. Fuller, you may have comments on this, but and also perhaps we can talk a little bit about ideas about the age of these carvings. How many generations really are there between them and us?
Well, I'd love to tell you that your petroglyphs could be thousands and thousands of years old, going back to the Ice Age. I don't think so, though. I assume they may be only 300 or 400 years old, maybe even less. They could be early historic. The site there in the Ohio I showed you would suggest that at least creating petroglyphs was very much something of a Native American tradition in many of the nations. And I can't speak for the Abenaki. They may be aware that there was a tradition of this happening among their people, as there was among the Ojibwe had a term for it. The Omaha and the Osage have terms for it because it did occur. And not that everyone created rock art. In fact, many times it was a person created rock art because spirits guided them to do this. And later on, for example, in the Omaha and Osage language, they would call the rock art the reflection of spirits, the writing of the shadows, because of the idea that this was something done by specialists, and acknowledging the fact that it's not graffiti, that it represented a way of marking the sacredness of that landscape. And I'm so glad that you're doing landscape archaeology, because fitting that rock art panel and other rock art panels into a landscape of villages and ceremonial areas and burial areas, I think is really essential and praiseworthy.
If I may just offer a comment on what you just said, Professor Fuller, the current nomination, currently the petroglyphs are part of that National Register nomination for the multi-use site, the Bellows Falls Island. it does not put it at all in that larger context of the landscape. And we know that that there were some significant habitation sites, burial sites. This Kchi Ponteku is a powerful place, in large measure drawing people to it as a center, as a community center, or so some of the traditions within the Abenaki community are telling us. And that's why we've opened this up again to revisit, to put these petroglyphs in that larger context, and to provide that opportunity for the Abenaki voice to be heard, and to help us better understand just what place these petroglyphs have in the larger scheme of things. Going back, and I understand that within the Abenaki community, there are oral traditions that suggest these carvings may have been done about 1,000 years ago. That's one set of traditions, as I've come to understand what I've heard. So I think some of the conversations that I've picked up on is that they may have been carved sometime around the year 1000 in the Common Era, using the Euro-American definition of time. I just wanted to throw that out because that question did come up about how old are they? Perhaps 300-400 years old, perhaps upwards of 1,000 years old.
You know, probably your Vermont archaeologists, New Hampshire archaeologists can look at the landscape and determine by radiocarbon dating, thermoluminescent dating, there are a couple of different methods, the age of other nearby sites, and from that begin to infer what could be the age of your petroglyph site, suggesting that the individuals residing at nearby villages and making burials and cemetery sites may have been the individuals responsible for the initial creation of the petroglyphs. You know, occasionally you'll find rock art sites where literally right beneath the rock art, there'll be pottery sherds or projectile points or bone tools or other objects that have been dropped and left at the time of the creation of the rock art, which then is a better way of suggesting the date of it. But from what I saw, the torrential water that would have rushed through that area has long removed what might have been left behind, either as offerings or as the tools and materials of the individuals who are responsible for making it.
I think someone raised a question about what tools might have been used to make these carvings. Would you like to comment on that?
I can tell you from a research project in Missouri, and again, I'm a resident of Missouri. Most of my field work and research has been on this part of the United States. In Missouri, at one of the sites where we do get large rock art panels, in 1959, looters were disturbing some burials near the rock art, and a archaeology student from University of Missouri Columbia excavated one of the partially uncovered burials, and it's now been processed through NAGPRA. But as he was excavating that, he found there was a pottery vessel, and then buried next to the person was a stone celt. And the celt was out of a granite-like stone that we find here in Missouri. In the center of the Ozarks, we have rhyolites and granites. This was a celt made out of a diabase, I believe, and it showed heavy evidence of literally, it was tipped And that tipped area showed multiple impact fractures and pounding. And then the other end of it mushroomed a little bit. And it was as if someone was taking and using it like a chisel. It was a stone chisel, though, not a metal chisel. And it was a graduate student who found that artifact, showed it to his professor, and the professor proclaimed it the tool that had been used for creating some of the rock art. And later on actually did a drawing of a master sort of instructing an apprentice in the process of pecking out the design elements. Now, I have not seen that artifact outside of photographs of it because it has gone through NAGPRA as well as the pottery vessel and the human remains. The pottery vessel was of a style about 1,000 years ago, a Mississippian style bottle is what it was. And would have been an interesting thought that was actually the burial of an artist. And it was not far. I mean, it wasn't like 10 feet away, but it was, 1,000 feet away from where the rock art had been created, which was on the top of a mountain, a hilltop. And this was a burial area. It must have been a small associated village area. And would a tool like that have been used? It could have been used. Yeah. And indeed, as your archaeologists are doing landscape archaeology, if something like that has been recovered, give it a consideration. Now, those tools were used for a variety of functions. I mean, they were not solely for creating rock art. But as far as I know, one of the only incidents that we have of a tool being moderately associated, closely associated with a Missouri rock art site was this one at Washington State Park, where it was a igneous rock that had been very carefully shaped and ground, not into an axe, but into, if you would, almost a pointed stone chisel.
Mm. Annette asks Dr. Fuller, have you done any work with grants regarding the heritage rivers of the United States? The Connecticut River is one of the 14 designated heritage rivers, and it fits 100% of the description. I believe we should be eligible for additional funds to help protect them. Annette, you may want to make more comment on that. Walter, you may have thoughts on it, and Dr. Fuller, you may have thoughts on it. I mean, yes, the Connecticut River is a designated heritage river.
It's gonna be terrible to tell you. I don't know if we have designated heritage rivers in Missouri. We should, probably we do. The bulk of my career has actually been Middle Eastern archaeology, and only as I got washed out of the Middle East with all of its problems and violences have I returned back to North American archaeology. And I have put a few sites on the National Register, and it's interesting that your site is part of a district, because I've created several National Register districts in the state of Missouri. And usually putting together a district is something that's done when you're trying to cover and protect and recognize a value of cultural resources in a couple of square miles, versus just pinpointing down to a single site saying, well, that site we're going to register and we're not going to register the ones around it. Because sometimes let's say if you'd registered just the petroglyphs, but not some of the other sites, well, then that's sort of a way of saying, well, those don't count. They're not culturally as significant as the petroglyphs were. And indeed, it may have been the desire to make a district was to recognize the historic materials, and the petroglyphs were just added in as a way of just bulking up the nomination. Who knows? I didn't do your nomination. I can't tell you. And I know of nominated districts that got rushed through, and I know nominated districts that were a long slug to get them on the nomination form. Making districts can be a heck of a problem, because all you need is one or two landowners who don't want their property part of a district, because the National Park Service is going to take it all away. They're sure, right? And
Well-
so I've had long negotiations sometimes to get people to agree to have their site included on a district nomination.
Fortunately, we have enough National Register districts around here to have gone through that process often enough that people do understand that it is not being on the National Register does not mean that you can't paint your house the color you wanted and all sorts of things like that, but it does. And that the island, the area where the petroglyphs are, has been on the National Register for quite a while. And I think the petroglyphs were considered an important contributing factor to that. I mean, there was the very first time I ever drove through Bellows Falls, which was quite a long time ago now, there was already, and there long since had been, a little sign pointing to the quote unquote Indian carvings. So it has been, they have been known, but I think we have had a lot of effort, a lot of new effort to educate ourselves about just trying to make sure we have covered if anyone had a question that didn't pop up, please please let us know. This don't everybody talk at once.
I'll just say thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was very interesting and I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thank you,
Thank you.
everyone else too for contributing.
Thank you.
Time to get ready to go underwater tomorrow morning. Bye.
Dave,
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Going
Annette.
underwater tomorrow morning is going to be more appealing than going underwater the last several months would have been, because it's getting a
Right,
little
yes.
warmer around here.
It'll be about 35, 40, but the water will be warmer anyway.
Yeah.
See you later. Thank you, Dr. Fuller.
my pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Dr. Fuller, just Annette is involved with this National Park Service funded project. She's the underwater archaeologist who is going to be doing underwater surveys between the Great Falls and heading downriver, down towards the Saxons River. So she's been diving down there for about 40 years on and off. So she's got quite an engagement.
Really?
By the way, I was
Love
going to mention, you said you weren't sure you had any historic rivers in Missouri. I can think of two rather large ones that come together not far from St. Louis that are both listed, I think, as historic rivers. They'd certainly better be.
I'm fifth generation born in the state of Missouri. You cannot imagine how many times the obvious has not been recognized or the obvious has not been allowed. There are a significant number of our politicians who really fear many times the historic preservation community and what they may be taking away and blah, 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 or planning to take away. So I'm hoping the Missouri River, I'm hoping the Mississippi River are in some kind of a historic river preservation program, heritage rivers. But I got to tell you, I've not heard of it. And that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, but yeah, just there you go.
Well, Missouri does manage to pull in a certain amount of tourism and interest from its river history. Obviously, Mark Twain comes to mind.
Yeah.
Somebody put up a tower near where the two rivers come together that you can
Right.
see the confluence from, and I went up on it. I wasn't part of a very big crowd on that. I'm not sure how successful that effort has been, but
Yep.
there's a lot to there. The Connecticut River and its significance, both from prehistory up to the present, is certainly a fascinating story.
It is.
Okay.
I sense a little bit of irony that this discussion on the petroglyphs is being done on Zoom, and you talk about talking heads. You know, it's so like,
Well, of
here
course,
we are.
it may be that may be exactly what it is. It's just an illustration of a Zoom meeting that the natives had 1,000 years ago. There is, as Dr. Fuller may be aware, there's an artistically rather interesting representation of the creation of the petroglyphs that was done as a WPA mural and is in what is now the middle school in Bellows Falls, was then the local high school, and as often happens, became the middle school. And there were a couple of rather nicely done, artistically rather good WPA murals, one of which shows the Native Americans fishing and carving the petroglyphs as kind of a way of doodling while they were waiting for the fish to come. It may not be anthropologically accurate, but it's a rather nice work of art. Okay, well, thanks.
I was just looking for that particular mural to see if I could pop it up real quickly, but I can't.
It's hard to take a picture of because you sort of have to look up at it from the stairs.
Let's see. Let me see if I can share my screen for a second. Do you see that?
Yep.
This is the artifact that was found in 1959 at Washington State Park. And actually, that is my photograph of it, because I did get to see it, didn't I? Huh. And you can see that it tapers to the left-hand side. And this was found as a grave offering with a burial that also had a Mississippian, very typical shell-tempered bottle buried along with it. And both the right-hand side has been beaten and damaged, as well as the left-hand side. And Dr. Carl Chapman, University of Missouri, Columbia, was convinced this is a diabase of artifact, that this had been what was being used, if you would, as a stone chisel to cut the petroglyphs. And so among the, and as far as I know, I mean, and these do show up at other archaeological sites. I've never seen one beat up the way this one is. I mean, it's a multifunctional tool. You could chop up, a deer carcass. You could clock somebody in the head with it. Or this one, because of the vast amount of damage to both ends of it, Chapman had suggested was used in actually creating the petroglyphs. And it was found by one of his graduate students who went on to Harvard University and got a master's in anthropology at Harvard, and Wyatt, who now lives up in the New York area, retired. So that's the possibility for what a tool might look like.
Yeah. Now this obviously is quite a quite a hard rock that can be used for a tool like that. The rock in which those petroglyphs are carved, is it comparably hard to get at to what the rock they're Bellows Falls is the petroglyphs in Bellows Falls, although they may be eroded, were carved into pretty hard rock. I'd have to tell you, I'm not enough of a geologist to know exactly what variety of rock it is. I'm thinking it's some kind of schist.
Yeah, I think it's a metamorphic schist, but I didn't stop to take a sample or really examine it that carefully. This would be slightly harder. It's an igneous rock, and so you're not going to be using sedimentary. You don't have a lime. You don't have one of these out of limestone that you're trying to cut the Bellows Falls rock with. You're going to have something equally hard or harder. Yep. Now you got that up in New England because you got glaciers, and the glacial tills and rocks got pushed all the way out of Canada, right, and left behind. And we find that in Missouri, that some places we get these tools being made out of the indigenous rock, then the volcanic core of the Ozarks. But we'll find these way up in northern Missouri where there's no outcrops of that kind of stone, and they're being made out of Canadian rock that they were picking up out of the glacier, and then they were using it.
Yeah.
So keep your eyes open for one of those.
Yeah.
Well, thank you everyone who invited me, and I'm getting family high sign to say goodbye and go get dinner. And I appreciate you, and I hope you got something that you could use out of the presentation.
Thank you
Certainly
so much,
did.
Dr. Fuller.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, sir. Bye-bye.